Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 174, The Case Is Altered. It is the pleasure of our fates that we should thus be racked on fortune's wheel. Last time, the esoteric world of Love's Labour's Lost kept us entertained with wordplay and flirtatiousness, and all a lot of fun. However unsatisfying, we might have found the ending. But now, it's time to leave Shakespeare for a moment and take a look at what might be Ben Jonson's first play, and all will become clear on that point in a moment. If you're just diving in here, or you need a refresher on Jonson, please go back to episodes 141 to 148, where I ran through the many ups and downs of Ben Jonson's life. But here and now, we have the bricklayer's son trying to make his way in the theatre and with the court. Until James came to the throne, he was pretty unsuccessful in the latter, and as far as we can tell, more or less from the off, his life writing for the public theatres was controversial. I recounted the events surrounding Johnson and Nashe's play The Isle of Dogs as part of Jonson's life story, and The Case Is Altered probably predates those events. What we can be sure of is that by 1579, the most likely date for The Case Is Altered, Johnson was working for Pembroke's men, and that they probably performed the play in May or June that year. The history of The Case Is Altered is more than a little problematic for us because Jonson chose not to include it in his first folio collection of 1616, or any of the subsequent folio collections, and he did so without explanation. This is a fact that has led to some speculation over its very authorship. It is not clear if, even though some early quarto editions of the play did include his name on the title page, he is denying that he wrote it, or a big enough part of it, or if he just thought that the play was not representative enough of his work to be included in his carefully curated folio. Jonson was not shy of putting his name on things as sole author or as collaborator, so the last of those options is probably the most likely. Some scholars have speculated that his name might have been inserted into the title page of the quarto as a selling point and without his permission, a theory based on the spacing of the print on the title page of surviving quarto editions. Perhaps with more certainty, it is also thought that as the quarto editions include many errors, and Jonson is known to have been a very thorough editor of his printed works, that he was not involved in the printing. The play seems to have been hurriedly issued. Aside from errors in spelling and punctuation which still remain, the abrupt ending of the division of acts and scenes, and the large portions of Act 5 which are clearly intended to be read as verse and yet are arranged as prose, would tend to confirm this view. All this uncertainty is compounded when we consider that, as a romantic comedy, the play differs from Jonson's other plays, and that matters such as the variety of plots and the treatment of the dramatic unities in the play run contrary to the classical ideals and practice that Jonson maintained in his other plays. That quarto printing was in 1609 and was made off the back of a revival of the play by the children of the chapel at the Blackfriars Theatre. This late printing date also leads to the possibility that this is not the script of the original production, but of the revival, where extra scenes and lines could have been added to accommodate the actors in the company who needed a role, or an expanded role, to satisfy current needs. All this might explain some of the problems with the structure of the play that have been detected by critics over the centuries since the script was first published. The play has a large cast, 25 named characters and an unnamed number of silent servants. Although many of these parts are very small, in which group I would include the 3 female roles, a production using the adult playing troupes of the time would involve a lot of doubling up. However, as this script comes from a production by the Children's Company at the Blackfriars Theatre, we might assume that it was easier to fill the smaller roles from the ranks of the apprentice boys to give them experience on the stage, and that an original adult production would not have included so many roles. The play is first mentioned in the record as early as 1598, this by Thomas Nashe, but there is no performance or text records from that time. 1598 is also the year that Every Man in His Humour was played, which in itself brings up questions for scholars of which play came first. I think it's fair to sum all of this up by saying that the general consensus is that the play is at least mostly by Jonson, but perhaps with later additions for the 1609 revival. The title of the play comes from a semi-legendary event in the life of Edward Plowden, a politician, jurist and defender of Catholics. While defending one accused of hearing Catholic Mass, he discovered that the whole thing was a set-up to entrap Catholics, and the man leading the service was not, in fact, an ordained priest. He is said to have revealed this boldly, stating that the case is altered, no priest, no Mass. It's a type of revelation that Jonson favoured in his plays, where he often introduced character or situation that alters the perception of what has gone before for the characters in the play and for the audience. It is a story that also would have resonated with Jonson's own fluctuating feelings about religion. Although this might be an unfair projection here, as a young man, his later torments over his religion were perhaps only just forming. Whatever the case, we hear the phrase repeated several times during the play as characters realise that all is not as it seemed. The plot of The Case Is Altered is derived from two plays by Plautus, The Captives and The Pot of Gold, which, for all his apparent misgivings about the play, Jonson weaved together quite skillfully to make a complete piece. Both of the Plautus plays involve the eventual discovery of supposedly dead characters who suddenly reappear to facilitate a happy resolution. As a rule, Jonson invented the plots of his plays, and when incidents were borrowed, they usually comprised only a small part of the play, suitably transformed to suit the situation. But here, Plautus is followed quite closely. This may be a reflection of Jonson's inexperience, and maybe lack of confidence as a young playwright. For all of his capricious talent, he was at the start of his career, and no doubt looking at others for ideas and inspiration. There's also a suggestion that the play was written in a hurry, perhaps to fill a gap in the schedule of Pembroke's men, and the use of the two Roman plays to create a new piece may have been at the suggestion of someone else, perhaps a theatre manager like Philip Henslowe, who left records of Jonson doing work for him in his diary, but not about this specific play. The Case Is Altered is an attempt by Jonson at a romantic comedy. This was not Jonson's favourite style, as proved by his later devotion to satire, a factor that suggests that the play might have been driven by an attempt at popularity. At this time, Greene, Munday and Dekker were all writing romantic comedies, and of course Shakespeare had had success in that genre too. It was one of the most popular genres of the closing decade of the 16th century, and if the play was written as a commission, then perhaps we see the hand of another in directing the young playwright into a genre that was not his natural playground, which is perhaps another reason why later on Jonson disregarded the play. It was soon after Jonson completed the play that he became involved in the War of the Poets, that argument between playwrights where over several years they jousted with each other in their plays. For this quarrel with Marston, Dekker and others, romantic comedy would hardly have been an appropriate form, and Jonson turned to satire. Once that quarrel fizzled out, Jonson stated his intention to turn to tragedy, and did so with Sejanus His Fall. But given the problems with the reception of that play, he went back to comedy, not the comedy of The Case Is Altered, but to satiric comedy, undoubtedly his greatest strength. Where there is satire in the play, it is very specific, and mostly in the character of Antonio Balladino. It is through this character that Jonson takes potshots at Anthony Munday, the playwright who Francis Mears called our best plotter. But we have no evidence of what might have prompted Jonson to allude to Munday in such a bad light. Scholars have suggested that Jonson took offence at not being credited as the best plotter and decided to have a laugh at Munday in revenge. Or perhaps the two playwrights had some personal beef that we are unaware of. Jonson was deeply opposed to the populist work of Munday, who he seemed to have regarded as a playwright who lacked any originality and was best placed to stick to the ballads he wrote, a literary form that Jonson held in very low regard. There's also speculation that Munday borrowed the vocal stylings of the character Juniper from The Case Is Altered for his 1598 play The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, and inserting this satire on Munday at a later date was Jonson's revenge for that presumption. Whatever the case, the identification of Munday as the butt of the joke seems quite certain. Antonio Balladino only appears in the opening scenes and serves no purpose to the plot. The name Balladino is doubly suggestive of Munday, referring to his activity as the writer of ballads and to his Palladino of England, which he translated from the French and published in 1597. In the play, Balladino is the pageant poet of the city of Milan, an office that Munday held for the city of London. Jonson also uses that best plotter phrase in reference to Balladino. Judged by Jonson's later satire, it's all quite mild, with Balladino appearing to be a rather foolish and pompous character who laps up the praise of Peter Onion, even though it is clear that Onion has not actually read any of his work. Although Balladino does not trouble the play any further, this episode does illustrate that what we can take from the play is not the mechanics of the plot, but the comedy derived from the interactions of the characters, and that includes several comic scenes that are inserted into the play but do not progress the plot at all. But, just so you know where we are, here's a very brief description of the plot, which divides into two strands dictated by the Plautus originals. The main plot follows the captives, where the recently widowed Count Farnese of Milan has been long separated from his two sons. Camillo, his eldest son, vanished 20 years ago during the battle for the capture of Venice. He is assumed to be dead, but during the action of the play it is revealed in fact that he was rescued by a French captain, Charmant, and he is now serving in the French army under the name of Gaspard. The French and Italian armies are currently engaged in hostilities, and the Count's second son, Paolo, is serving in the Italian army. Much to his father's distress, Paolo is captured by the Italians about the same time that Gaspard and his companion Charmant, the son of Gaspard's earlier saviour, are captured by the Italians. The Count arranges a prisoner swap to get Paolo released, exchanging him for Charmant. But his plan goes wrong when Gaspard and Charmant swap identities. When the Count discovers he has the wrong man, he threatens to kill Gaspard, but in a moment of supernatural insight, he hesitates and then spares his victim. In the last act of the play, there are a series of revelations that reveal Gaspard as the long-lost Camillo, and the second son, Paolo, is also restored to his father. The secondary plot, taken from The Pot of Gold, includes a similar mix of concealment, disguise and discovery. The seemingly poor Jacques de Prix is shown in fact to be Melun, the former servant of Lord Charmant, who many years previously had run off not only with Charmant's fortune, but his baby daughter Isabel too. Isabel, now known as Jacques' daughter Rachel, is the subject of many amorous advances from various characters, from the Count himself to Paolo and his friend Angelo, who distrustfully woos Rachel on his own behalf rather than Paolo's, down to the servants like Peter Onion. Jacques is a miser who loves to admire his illicitly acquired gold in private, but he is constantly interrupted by the visitors seeking out Rachel. He is convinced that they are only there to get their hands on his gold, and he becomes so paranoid about it that he believes the visitors can detect the gold by its smell, and they will eventually discover it. He resolves to bury the gold in horse manure to disguise it, a strategy that is in the end unsuccessful, thanks to Peter Onion and his cohort Juniper. Jacques loses everything, while Rachel is united with the true object of her affection, the Count's second son, Paolo. These two plots become linked through the characters that cross over between the strands, and there is a complete resolution in Act 5 that depends on a lot of revelations that build to a frenetic peak. So there is something to admire in the skill Jonson shows in handling the plot and action, but there are weaker points too. Of those, we might pick out in particular the opening scenes of the play, where there is a lot of stage business and what we would now think of as banter between the male courtly characters, That is comic, but does not progress the plot, or do much to establish the key characters. Exposition and backstory is only drip-fed very slowly. Nobody wants a mass of exposition recited through a long opening of a play. That would suggest that the playwright had started the action in the wrong place in the story. But this is a play that needs to get on with itself earlier than it does. Fortunately, the pace of the plot does pick up, but then there are other times when it is stopped dead by a scene of comic business. Of the several scenes that have been included for no apparent plot purposes and in addition to the opening scenes, the most obvious are in the second act, where there is a scene concerning characters who get involved in a bout of fencing, and another where there is a sort of game of how to greet a foreigner undertaken by some minor characters. No doubt the contemporary audiences were rolling in the aisles, but it's a bit difficult for us to get many of the jokes. To give you a sense of some of that exposition and the language, here is the speech given by the Count describing the loss of his eldest son, Camillo. I had one other younger born than this, by twice as many hours as would fill the circle of a year, his name Camillo, whom in that black and fearful night I lost. 'Tis now 19 years agone at least, and yet the memory of it sits as fresh within my brain as 'twere but yesterday. It was the night wherein the great Charmont, the general for France, surprised Vicenza. Methinks the horror of that clamorous shout, his soldiers grave when they attained the wall, yet tingles in mine ear. Methinks I see, with what amazed looks, distracted thoughts, and minds confused, we that were citizens, comforted one another. Every street was filled with bitter self-tormenting cries, and happy was that foot that first could press the flowery champaign bordering on Verona. Here I, employed about my dear wife's safety, whose soul is now in peace, lost my Camillo, who sure was murdered by the barbarous soldiers, or else I should have heard. My heart is great, sorrow is faint, and passion makes me sweat. An important point about this play is that it is a humours play, and although the theory of the humours is not as prevalent as it is in other Jonson plays, it is worth lingering on it here for a moment, as we will encounter it again. The concept of the humours probably dates back to ancient Egyptian medicine, but it was the ancient Greeks who formalised it into a system that pervaded Western thinking until relatively modern times. In the Greek, the word translated as humour literally means juice or sap. We might say flavour. The concept was one that stated that human behaviour was governed by the liquids found naturally in the body. The ancient Greeks, even Hippocrates himself, refined the idea and defined the bodily fluids as blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. As he said in his treatise On the Nature of Men, the human body contains blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. These are the things that make up its constitution and cause its pain and health. Health is primarily the state in which these constituent substances are in the correct proportion to each other, both in strength and in quantity, and are well mixed. Pain occurs when one of the substances presents either a deficiency or an excess, or is separated in the body and not mixed with others. The theory was then further refined by Galen to suggest that an excess of any of these fluids could not only be a sign of illness, but affect behaviour too. The theory was further developed over the centuries, so that by the early modern period, the full theory also made reference to the effect of the seasons and astrology in conjunction with bodily humours. Throughout The Case Is Altered, the characters refer to the humours as being the cause of behaviour, and sometimes even to their own behaviour, and some are constructed by Jonson as a character type governed by the humours. Count Farnese is a good example of this. He is hot-tempered and quick to anger. A more modern mind might put this down to his anxiety at losing his last remaining son, or grief at the recent death of his wife. But for Jonson, it is a result of humoral imbalance. But the Count is not a completely one-dimensional character. He jokes with Angelo and the others of his son's generation, and chides his daughters first playfully and then seriously over their interest in the young men. He is subject to quickly changing moods and impulses that pass as quickly as they arrive. When he feels betrayed, he commands torture and escalates the imprisonment of Camillo to a death sentence with seemingly little thought. We might see his interest in Rachel as nothing more than impulse too, perhaps promoted by the realisation that she is the object of Cristofero's advances, among others. He certainly shows little concern when, in the end, she declares herself for his son. He is the centre of some of the comedy of the play, when he becomes exasperated with his awkward servants, whom his own impatience has confused, and he becomes almost frenetic. But when Juniper enters, a moment later, to intercede for Onion, his equanimity is, it seems, easily restored. The character of Jacques or Jakes or Jaques, I'm not sure, but I'm going to go with Jacques, and his fellow miser Eusilio have the traits of that well-known character type. They don't see beyond their gold, which they worry over continuously and obsessively. They live and dress poorly and lay great stress on their poverty. As the suitors for Rachel come to Jacques' house, he repeatedly reminds them that there is no dowry, and this is only after he has worried over if they can detect his gold or not. The natures of both misers are so suspicious that all who approach them are regarded with distrust. Oblivious to everything but their gold, they treat their inferiors with cruelty, and their friends are made to wonder at their strange actions. If they have a sense of humour, their obsession prevents them displaying it. Except for in one soliloquy by Jacques, neither shows any affection for Rachel. Indeed, she is in the firing line when Jacques realises that his gold has been stolen, even though he had previously expected her to protect the gold when he was absent. Perhaps there is a touch of Marlowe's Jew of Malta here, but with a comic twist. Jacques is perhaps the most imposing figure in the play, and certainly the centre of his part of the plot. There is usually action when he appears, and when he soliloquises, he demands attention. At times, he can be a skilful player, softening even the Count with his deference, humility, and plea of poverty. But then he grasps Juniper by the hair and alternately rages at the peril of his gold, or is bewildered at the strangeness of Juniper's words. He is the same Jacques who, at the sound of any human voice, runs into his house to look for his gold, frantically calling on Rachel and Garlic, his guard dog, to aid him. Garlic the dog is not seen, and it is up to us to imagine an Alsatian or a terrier, but it does offer the opportunity for more onion-based jokes at the expense of Peter Onion's name, and there are plenty of those in this play. The business with the burying of the gold in a pile of horse dung, because the paranoid Jacques thinks that it can be detected by its smell, is the comic high point of the play. There is no stage directions in the script that suggest what comic business might have been associated with the gold in the pile of dung, but if I might paraphrase Chekhov, one must never place a pile of dung on stage if someone is not going to get covered in it. In many of his subsequent works, we will see Jonson use a central object or place as a magnet to draw his characters in and allow them to interact. It is a drawing in that often leads to their downfall. The idea of the possibility of great wealth is often one of those attractions, but here it is in fact not the gold that attracts Jacques' visitors, but the beauty of his apparent daughter. Eventually Jacques realises that this is the case, and his perception shifts. The case is altered. Perhaps Jonson does not go as far as to suggest that it is love that makes the world go round. After all, elsewhere in the comedy, it is the love of money that drives things along. Knowing as we do of Jonson's own struggles for money, and at this point of his career for recognition too, it's not difficult to believe that he could not bring himself to completely endorse the entirely romantic ending of the play, and to leave us also with a slightly bitter taste that lingers over the fate of Jacques. But for some, it is a failure of the play that in this basic question it does not provide a definitive answer, for all of its frenetic concluding action. As I mentioned, the three female characters in the play are of little importance and are severely underdeveloped characters. Despite this, for many critics, Rachel is Jonson's only realistic and lovable female character. Clearly, it wasn't a character type that he was interested in exploring or found useful to his aims. Rachel is very lightly sketched, whereas the farcical situations that Juniper, Jacques and Onion find themselves embroiled in are worked out much more carefully, and, it would seem, with much greater interest. John Dryden summed it up when he said of Jonson, "You seldom find him making love in any of his scenes or endeavouring to move the passions. His genius was too sullen and saturnine to do it gracefully, especially when he knew he came after those who had performed both to such a height. Humour was his proper sphere." For all of her centrality to the love interest part of the plot, Rachel has very few lines of dialogue, and the Count's two daughters, Aurelia and Finazella, are often silently present on stage and also have little to say. From their brief appearances, we can see that they are of opposite types. One who cries and lingers in her grief for her mother, the other who laughs and wants to move on. I do rather like Aurelia's response to her sister's chiding at her willingness to behave in ways not keeping with the mourning process, when Johnson shows that he can insert character even when the sketch is a brief one. "Sister Faith, you take too much tobacco. It makes you black within, as ye are without. What true stitch, sister? Both your sides alike? Be of a slighter work. For of my word, you shall be sold as dear, or rather dearer. Will you be bound to customs and to rights? Shed profitable tears, weep for advantage, or else do all things as you are inclined. Sate when your stomach serves, saith the physician, not at 11 and 6. So if your humour be now affected with this heaviness, give me the reins and spare not, as I do, in this my pleasurable appetite. I wept, you saw too, when my mother died, and then I found it easier to do so, and fitter with my mood, than not to weep. But now 'tis otherwise. Another time, perhaps, I shall have some deep thoughts of her, and I shall weep afresh, some 12 months hence. And I will weep if I be so disposed, and put on black as grimly then as now. Let the mind go still with the body's stature. Judgment is fit for judges. Give me nature." On that note, it's also worth mentioning that the willingness of the Count to move on only 3 months after the death of his apparently beloved wife would not have been thought of as unusual or unfeeling at the time. Given the dangers of childbirth, widowers were common, and often remarried quickly, expecting a new wife to take on all the duties of the old, including the care of stepchildren. In the Count's case, he also has the prospect of being without an heir if his second son is also likely not to return from the war, as for a while he believes is the case. Nobody would have thought of his turning to a potential wife of childbearing age the least bit unusual. And at the end of the play, the world is put right by the restoration of the sons, the prospective punishment of those who deserve it, and a wedding or two in prospect. Unfortunately, it is very unlikely that you will get to see a production of The Case Is Altered. As far as I can see, it has only ever been revived in student productions in recent years, which is a shame. Perhaps with some cutting, updating of the satire, and focus on the visual and physical comedy that could undoubtedly be found in the play, it could be a successful comedy-come-farce revival. There is a reading of the play by the Adventurous Beyond Shakespeare group that you can find on YouTube, where the readers also discuss the play as they progress through the script. I certainly found it very useful in helping my understanding of the play. Though it is possible to see in The Case Is Altered the potential ingredients for future darker Jonson plays like Volpone, it is probably best to see this early comedy as an apprentice piece, where the young playwright was still finding the skills needed for full marrying of tone and structure in a play. The shift from the satiric mode to the romantic mode is an uneasy one, and something that Jonson sensibly avoided in later plays. But what we can see here is an attempt at the comedy of the humours, something that he would embrace to much greater success, and he would do that soon in his next plays, Every Man in His Humour and Every Man Out of His Humour, which is what we will come to next when we return to the work of Ben Jonson. But before that, and next time, I have something a little different for you, as in a guest episode where we get to hear all about Shakespeare on the radio, and particularly the role productions of Shakespeare have played in BBC radio over the years. In the meantime, if you have not already done so, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com, or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.